Well, as we talk about a Liberal majority in the House, it was Monday's three by-elections that pushed the Carney government over the top, with the newly re-elected Tatiana Auguste and the newly elected Dr. Danielle Martin and Dolly Begum taking the Liberal seat count to 174. Now, it was expected that the Liberals would take at least two of the three races, and if the Liberals had lost Terrebonne, it was predicted the seat would have gone to the Bloc. So Conservatives, well, they were never really in the race, but according to some astute political watchers like our next guest, they say Conservatives should not ignore the final results. And if you're wondering who I'm hinting to, we're now joined by polls analyst Eric Grenier, the founder and the writer of the Writ. Eric, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you, Michael.
So the Liberals sweep and take all three of the by-elections this week. Two in Toronto, described as safe Liberal seats. The race in Montreal, as I said, Terrebonne, was a Bloc seat, not a Conservative seat. So why should the Conservatives be worried about the results?
Well, certainly the most important question in any by-election is who wins and who loses. In this case, as you mentioned, it was all expected that the Conservatives would lose all three of these. But when you look at what has happened in the vote share for the Conservatives, these were the worst by-elections that the party has had in at least a decade. So they're not that easy to brush off when you see just how poorly the Conservatives have done compared to past performances by the party under a number of different leaders. These by-elections are at the top for just how bad it could get for the Conservatives.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into what you're saying right now. By-election race by-election race, beginning with the Toronto riding of University Rosedale, the former riding of Chrystia Freeland. Break down what you see when you take a look at those numbers.
Well, there wasn't that much movement when it came to the Liberals. They held the same 64% of the vote that Chrystia Freeland got in the last election. So Danielle Martin was able to get that same vote out to the polls. We did see that the NDP vote did jump quite a bit, jumped to 19%. Now, that is still less of a jump than the amount of vote they lost in the last election. So the NDP still has some work to do. But getting back to that second position in a riding like University Rosedale is good news for the NDP. But again, we saw that the Conservatives dropped 11 points here in University Rosedale to the worst result that the party has ever had in this part of Toronto, at least in the modern kind of riding borders that we've seen. So most of the movement here seemed to be between the NDP and the Conservatives, though not necessarily was those voters that moved, but we did see that the NDP was able to leapfrog the Conservatives in this Toronto riding.
Okay, leapfrog there in University Rosedale. Let's move now a bit more east, staying in Toronto, but in the riding of Scarborough Southwest, the longtime riding of former Trudeau Minister Bill Blair. Talk to us about what you're seeing in those numbers.
Yeah, there again, we saw the Liberals put up 70% of the vote, which, as far as I can tell, is the highest that they've gotten in that part of Scarborough, at least ever. And for the Conservatives, they had 31% in the last election. It's not necessarily a good Conservative riding. It actually went to the NDP in 2011. The Conservatives haven't held it since the Brian Mulroney years. But it is still a diverse riding. It's a suburban riding in the inner suburbs of Toronto. And to see the Conservative vote here drop by 12 points down to just 18%, again, this is the worst result they've had in this area. So when you see those kinds of results, they do set off a few alarm bells. It's not just a drop, it's a big drop, and a drop to a level that the Conservatives haven't seen before in this part of Toronto.
Okay, and the third by-election, really the closest race of this past week, the by-election in Terrebonne. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that was probably the one that was also the most interesting, but also maybe the most surprising. The vote just absolutely polarized between the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois, who combined took over 95% of the vote. Voters in that riding had been told time and time again how much their vote counted, because obviously in the previous election it had been decided by one vote. So I think that voters in Terrebonne were particularly motivated not to, quote unquote, waste their vote on a party that wasn't in contention. Both the Liberals and the Bloc saw their vote increase by a significant amount. The Liberals to their highest level since 1980, when Pierre Trudeau won 74 of 75 seats in Quebec. The Conservatives dropped to 3%. Now, 3% in Terrebonne is a very bad result. It is the worst result the Conservatives have ever had in this riding, in all of its history in this part of Quebec. The only time they've taken less is when the Liberals won by acclamation, because there was no candidate that was put forward in over 100 years ago. And so just to see this kind of result here, a drop of 15 points, this is the worst performance that the Conservatives have had in a by-election since the last years of the Stephen Harper government, when people were moving away from the Conservatives, going over to the Liberals, and of course that foreshadowed the defeat that was coming in 2015.
Okay, so those are the three races. So when you take all of that, then Eric, what message do you think, or perhaps warning you think, that Conservatives should be taking out of all this?
That what they've been seeing in the polls is real, and it is a problem for the Conservatives. The fact that these are the biggest losses that they've had over the last 10 years should be concerning, because Pierre Poilievre's whole pitch to the Conservative base is that he is still the best person to lead the party to a victory, and that when you look at the last election's result, the Conservatives hit some pretty good results, right? They had their best share of the vote since 1988. But when you have these kinds of by-election results, it doesn't suggest that you're in that territory anymore. And you could claim that these are not ridings where the Conservatives were in contention, so their voters didn't bother to go out and vote. But we've seen by-elections over the last few years where the Conservatives were equally out of the running, and their vote still showed up, and in fact they got more of the vote. You can think of La Salle-Verdun in 2024. This was a riding in Montreal where the Conservatives were known not to be in it. They had 8.5% of the vote in the 2021 election in that riding. They still managed to get more of their people out to the ballots, and they got 11% in that by-election. So it shows that even in ridings where the Conservatives aren't in contention, their vote still shows up, but they didn't show up in these three. And I don't think it's a good idea for the Conservatives to wave it off as a by-election. Something bad happened to the party here, and I think they need to figure out what and how to fix it.
Okay, and with that, let's talk about the latest polls. What are they showing you right now?
Well, in the Writ's projections, we have the Liberals leading by 12 points over the Conservatives, about 46 to 34%. And I think that these by-election results corroborate those polls, with the Conservatives having lost on average 13 points in these three ridings. A little bit exaggerated because of the context of the ridings, of the fact that they were in contention. But it does align with the polls that have suggested that the Conservatives have dropped perhaps as much as 8 or 9 points in the polls nationwide. So we're still seeing that the Liberals are in a very strong position. They have their majority in the House of Commons. They would win a majority right now if an election were held. And so I guess we just see where things are going to go from here. The next election is scheduled for 3.5 years. If the Liberals continue to put up a 14-point lead over the Conservatives, or a 12-point lead, they might be tempted to go a little bit earlier than that.
Yeah, and of course we continue to watch. Eric, thank you for this. Appreciate the insight.
Thank you.